because we want to post this on our NNLM YouTube channel so that people can access this at a later date. And finally, I will say if you are interested in obtaining Medical Librarian Association CE credits, we'll discuss at the end, and I'll provide a link with the survey on how to obtain the 1 hour credit that you'll get for attending this Kernel of Knowledge session. So I'll just start by saying, for those participating for the first time, Kernel of Knowledge is an ongoing expert speaker webinar series presented by the GMR that provides 1 hour sessions on recent research or relevant trending topics with time for questions from you, the viewing audience. One slight change to today's process, if you've done this before, is our presenter is going to be discussing 2 separate studies. So we're going to kind of break it up, and after the first study, we'll pause and see if anybody has any questions about that, and then we'll move on to the second study, and then again, we will have additional time for questions at the end of that one. Move the screen forward here. Again, my name is Sam Watson, and I'm going to be hosting here from the GMR office. I am the Academic Outreach Specialist here at the University of Iowa. And our presenter today is going to be Catherine Arnott-Smith. She is an associate professor from the Information School at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Today, she'll be discussing some of her findings from 2 studies pertaining to health information and how it intersects with public library workers. So with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand it over to you, Catherine, and take it away.
Okay. And here I go sharing. Did that work?
Is working. If you want to maybe do the presentation mode so it's bigger.
Okay. So thanks everybody for dialing in or attending or whatever you want to call it. This slide just gives a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to begin by introducing myself a little bit to help you put the research in context. But more importantly, I want to introduce 2 main ideas for you to keep in mind as you hear about these studies. The first is the idea that health information questions are very old questions, and the second is what I will call the advice problem. Then I will give details in reverse chronological order, first about study 1, which is the most recent one, Public Libraries and Health Information, followed by study 2, Public Libraries and the Affordable Care Act. Then I'll give you a few ideas about what these studies turned out to have in common. And finally, minutes for Q&A, minutes depending on how much we talk after study 1 and how much we have left after study 2. I would really like your feedback through your questions and comments at the end, so thanks in advance. I am a former medical librarian with experience in both academic but mostly corporate settings. And I moved into the field of biomedical informatics when I was a doctoral student at one of NLM's medical informatics training programs. This is the one that was then the center. It is now the Department of Biomedical Informatics at the University of Pittsburgh. I have been a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison since 2006, but I was at Syracuse University for 4 years before that. What I'm particularly interested in is the role of health vocabularies in mediating clinical information for consumers and patients as opposed to the healthcare professionals that they were designed for. And towards that end, I study things like patient portals and clinical documentation, but I also study the exchange of health information in non-clinical spaces like the patient's home, archives, and public libraries. And it's public libraries that are the topic today. So one very important idea that I want to get across right at the beginning is that while it is really tempting to blame information technology in general and the web specifically for a whole lot of things in life, the fact is that people have been drawn to medical information for a very, very long time. And in public libraries, also for a very, very long time. So the earliest published evidence I have found for medical information intended for the public in public libraries was actually the Worcester, Massachusetts Public Library in 1893. And one clue that the public's appetite for health information is in fact classic and timeless is the fact that every generation of medical librarians that researches and publishes about the public's demand considers that demand to be a trend. It is actually one of the longest lived trends that we have in librarianship. So in 1921, a physician named John Farlow told the Medical Library Association at their annual meeting, quote, "An ever increasing number of the community is taking a larger and larger interest in medicine and health. We cannot help noticing a very lively interest on the part of the public in subjects which, not so very long ago, were supposed to be the monopoly of the medical profession." So again, he's saying in 1921, not so very long ago, we thought we had a monopoly on this stuff. Then in 1958, Stein and Lucioli wrote about public libraries, quote, "inundated by the recent flood of popular books in the health field," unquote. So by 1978, and I have to say the 1970s are what most textbooks will say is the beginning of interest in consumer health information. I don't disagree at all that it was a period of explosion in resources, but it's actually way older than 1978. Ellen Gartenfeld in 1978 complained that even health sciences libraries are, quote, "now being asked to add to their collections materials that they do not know how to evaluate," unquote, due to the demand for them from the public. So the references for all these things I've quoted will be linked to on the last slide. Don't worry, you'll get those. But why am I giving you these historical factoids? It's because I want to underline. Sorry?
I'm interrupting you for a second. Can we possibly get you to switch your display settings? At the top of your screen, I think it says display settings. And swap presenter and slide view. Okay.
Sorry, I have two monitors and I wasn't actually sure which it was picking up. Does that look better? I just
yes, that's
them.
Perfect, Catherine.
Good. All right.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
No, thank you.
Yeah, so the historical factoids, why? Because I'm really trying to underline my long-held belief that the public's interest in health information has very little to do with information technology because it predates information technology in the sense of computers, right? So here's the other important idea I want you to think about. It's what I call the advice problem. I found the very first mention of the advice problem in professional literature published in 1931. And this is a little screenshot, which I underlined, from the Wilson Library Bulletin. Citation is on the slide. This was an article based on a talk to a library association given by a woman named Catherine Dame, who was at that time the head of reference at St. Paul Public in Minnesota. If there's any Minnesotans out there, she's your girl. She wrote about, quote, unanswerable questions. This meant really unanswerable patrons, like the mom she described who, quote, describes her child's symptoms over the telephone, saying he is running a temperature, etc., and asking what she shall do for him. This is no fit question for a layman, wrote Ms. Dame. We can refer people to the books in which medical symptoms are handled, but to attempt to prescribe for patients might land the librarian in the criminal courts, unquote. So just as an aside, I find it personally fascinating that the patron's child is called a patient in this write-up. Was he really a patient or was he just a consumer's kid? These are actually the questions that drive my research program. But what is important here is that if the patron's child is called a patient, the patron's question, like what shall she do for him, apparently runs the risk for Ms. Dame of turning the librarian into a doctor. Why? Because the patron was asking for advice. So this is all wedded to the long-held public librarian fear that the public librarian personally and or the public library as an institution will be held legally liable for providing medical information without a license. So Catherine Dame clearly felt it necessary to stress this point in her article from 1931. So clearly it's out there before 1931, but this is the oldest reference I have found to it. But Catherine Dame's piece was repeatedly cited as a source for the "don't answer medical questions, you're legally liable" in successive editions of key library science textbooks in general reference, although not medical librarianship textbooks, ever since 1931. And you still hear it from librarians today. At an important early professional training event, which was the California Bay Area Reference Center Workshop on Consumer Health, which was given for public librarians in 1979. The advice problem was, quote, a fundamental theme mentioned by almost all the workshop participants to the organizers when they solicited topics from the people who were attending that they wanted talked about. Almost everybody said, we want to talk about advice. So the warning was given by the conference organizers against interpretation and the giving of medical advice no less than 6 times in 13 pages of narrative coming out of this workshop. And they quoted examples of policies from places like Kaiser Permanente's library in Oakland, the Fremont, California main library, and other library systems. And that was in 1979. So it's an old worry. My question for these studies was really, how are these twin problems, the very old need, the very old worry, affecting provision of health information in public libraries today? So with that, let me kick into the discussion of study 1, which was the most recent one, focus groups. These were focus groups held virtually with library workers from all sizes of public libraries nationwide, asking them to talk freely and anonymously about challenges and opportunities arising around health information in a public library space. This study was funded by the same good people that are running this webinar, the folks at the Greater Midwest region of the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. So how did I get library workers? 2 waves. The first wave was cold calls, or cold emails really, from me to a randomly selected 150 public libraries drawn from the IMLS Public Library Dataset, fiscal year 2015, which is the most recent available when we put the study together. So there was quite a bit of initial interest, but we got only 3 confirmed participants in 2 weeks out of the initial 150 that we cold emailed. So clearly, to have this study happen in the spring, a wider net needed to be cast. So we went into the second wave, which went great. That was asking the Public Library Association to help. Thank you, PLA. They helped publicize the study on the PubLib listserv, the PLA Leaders email list, PLA's Facebook page, and their Twitter feed. It also ran in a late March issue of PLA's e-newsletter, and this worked very well. It yielded about 100 more responses, which turned into less than 100 actual participants, but that's actually pretty good. Here is an excerpt to let you see what the recruitment message was that went out in all these venues. I basically said, I'm looking for workers in public libraries, both paraprofessional and professional. The purpose of this research was described, challenges and rewards, etc. I specifically said we are interested in questions, experiences, concerns, and success stories. It's all useful. So the way it went, for those of you who've done research, you know how this goes. Once a potential participant responded to the call, I then sent an email with an informed consent form to sign. And that's usually the point where people who are vaguely interested drop out because they don't feel like going through all the paperwork. But unfortunately, universities want you to go through paperwork. So when the informed consent form gets returned, that is what triggered assignment of scheduling to one of my 3 students working on the project. And all of these students, by the way, had experience in public libraries as paraprofessionals or as students. So they were super into this. 57 public library workers turned out to actually go through all the hoops and finally participate in the study. Each of them got a $25 Amazon gift card. We limited participation to get as diverse a representation as we could to 1 person, which could be a paraprofessional or a professional of any job title from 1 library branch. Participants met in virtual focus groups handled via GoToMeeting between March and May of this year. The groups numbered from 2 to 5. There were 5 individual interviews for interested people who had like really complex work schedules, so they just didn't fit with anybody else. Or sometimes what happened is they were the only person who showed. They were actually supposed to be in a 2 to 3 member group, but the other 2 gave it a miss. So there were 5 individual interviews, but all the others were groups. The participants were from all over the country. This little simplistic map, it has to be simplistic because I can't tell you exactly where they were, but these are the states they were in, I can tell you that much. So it shows you a distribution here. But there was one weird thing that happened, which is that hardly anybody from the West Coast responded to either wave of recruitment. We have actually no idea what accounts for this, but almost everybody who did respond from the West Coast ended up participating. I just wish we'd had more. So you do see this real concentration on the eastern seaboard and somewhat to the west, and then the further west you go, the more sparse it is. So who were these folks in the focus groups? Of the total 57 participants, there were 14% in rural settings, 9% town, 42% suburban, and 35% city libraries. 56% of them were professionals. Now, 11% of people we could identify as paraprofessionals from publicly available information. 33% of them, it's very unclear from places like their library websites what their status was. I like to assume those are paraprofessionals because when people have master's degrees in library science, they tend to tell you. But technically, 33% of those we don't know. 11% of them were actually in jobs that focused on children and teens. I was kind of tickled to see that. The job titles were varied. We had everybody. We had a page, we had a clerk, we had an interlibrary loan person who does mostly interlibrary loan. We had 7 directors and we had 7 reference librarians. Of the job titles that we were given, only 2 had job titles that actually upfront signaled a specialization in consumer health on the job. One was called a health reference librarian, one was called a consumer health librarian. So here's what we asked them about. The topics are on the slide. We have just an hour today and I've got 2 studies to get through, so I'm focusing at the moment on the one in bold. Which is, what is the biggest challenge you see for public library workers who get health information questions? That was actually our lead question to get people talking. Note that people contributed multiple themes. So in the slides that follow, what I'm giving you is the top 5. The ones that came up the most often first, then there was a very, very long tail after the 5th. So I'm not going to get into those. Lots and lots of different things that people thought were challenges. On the following slides, you'll see a number immediately after the title of the slide. That is the number of times that the theme was mentioned in the groups by a unique participant. So the most frequently occurring theme was, ta-da, advice. It's the advice problem. This turned up all the time. 23 unique people mentioned it. So this is perhaps the most full-fleshed of the responses. I really like this one. This was a librarian, a professional, who before participating in the focus group, she didn't know what she'd be talking about. She said she talked to some librarians at her branch to get an overall idea of how her colleagues were, how comfortable they were in working with the public. She says the main question that kept coming up is how far to go with the information you give. She says everybody's comfortable with directing people to databases, finding the information and so forth, but they're having issues with how much you actually say and how far do you go. Why? Because you have to maintain that professionalism, not cross the line of giving too much information or appear to be diagnosing in any way. So I found that fascinating, of course. After that, we had patron expectations. I love this quote from a very large system in the state of New York. I feel like I'm being asked to operate as a human WebMD. Now, we could all wish for human Medline Plus, but that's a lot to ask for. Human WebMD is funny. This person said that is not something I'm comfortable with, but it is definitely something this librarian's patrons expect. After that, the problem of boundaries, which is clearly related to the advice problem. We can find information. We're not nurses or doctors or physician's assistants or anything. Followed by expertise. I find this quote really interesting. This came from a library worker in a very, very small town in South Carolina. Distant rural is IMLS's categorization of rural and many miles from a city. So you're really out there in the boonies. And this person said, sometimes we have patrons who come in and they give us what they think is the proper term. And we have to find out what the proper term actually is. And that delays us in finding what it is because we don't have this healthcare background. So she's identified several problems in this one pithy paragraph, that the terminology trips them up because it's a communication problem between the patron and the librarian. But because the expertise in healthcare is not there, it is difficult to find out what the right word is, which you see is the key to finding the information they need. So I love the denseness of this quote, and those are the top 5 themes. So at this point, before getting into the second study, I'd just like to move to Q&A. So let's hear it.
All right. Well, listeners, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. Catherine, I guess I can start. There was one question that popped up on slide 11, which you're talking about the methods and the participants.
Yes.
From Mike and Michael, and he was asking, are those library type breakdowns from IMLS data?
Yes, they are. And I'm sorry, I've gone blank on the specific code, but this is the one that gets at, I think it's location code. It is the most granular you get about the kind of community it was. If Michael wants to send me an email, I can send him after we're offline. I can send him a link to where I got that from, but those are all IMLS's labels.
Great. And I believe you have your email posted at the end of
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Catherine, we had kind of fixed the display problem, but there's still kind of a zoom in with the slides. I don't know if that's anything we can fix further.
Yeah, it looks fine on my end.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm not sure what would be fixed.
That's all right. Another question we have here from Anne. What are the sources your participants said they used to help with these situations?
We asked them, and it's funny, the web has been around now long enough that people kind of fall into shorthand. They will say things like, oh, I go to the usual. Of course, we heard Google the most, but my focus group moderator students and I tried very hard to get people to get specific. So we heard the most is WebMD. Medline Plus we heard quite a lot. I was very pleased with that. But I would say we heard I just Google it, or I Google it and go to a trusted source, much more than we heard any specifics. Now in study 2, there was much more data on that because that was a web-based survey. But in talking, people get very informal very quickly. So the data is not as great on that particular question.
Okay. And I have a question here. Someone said they only got 4: advice, expectations, boundaries, and expertise. Were there 5?
That was the top. Wait, I thought it was 5. Sorry, I'm flipping back. Oh, sorry, evaluation. Sorry, I skipped a slide. It's evaluation, which was right after expertise, which is people saying evaluation is a challenge, so finding reputable sites that are easy for them to understand, the patron to understand, so they don't just go straight to Google to find stuff. That was a representative quote there. So it's basically talking about the work of doing the evaluation for the librarian.
Okay. We have a question here from Eleanor, I believe. So what do these public libraries do when faced with these questions, these interactions, refer to their primary care physician or refer to WebMD or Medline Plus or?
We did have a specific question about what agencies, entities, community partners, et cetera, do you refer to? And there are definitely some respondents who are very uncomfortable with these kinds of questions. And so their first response is to refer to the patron's personal physician. And then if they establish that the patron doesn't have one or is, transient or whatever, then they are saying they go to the social service agencies. So in terms of sources, we do have this question about what sources do you go to? And like I said earlier, we don't get as many specifics there as we'd like in the focus groups, but I do hear a lot of WebMD and Medline Plus, frankly. Lots of Medline Plus.
Sure. Catherine, your slides disappeared from the computer. Are they displayed?
I have no idea why. All right, here we go. Try this again.
And if it doesn't work out, Catherine, too, we can pull it up on our end.
Yeah, if that works better.
Is that back?
Yes. And I think it's in full display now.
Huh, it's weird.
Correct me if I'm wrong, chat box, but I think that is as it should be looking.
Sorry, there's the evaluation slide that I missed. Okay.
All right, looks like we got that fixed. I have some questions about the slides since they were a little off center here at the beginning. Is this something we could mail out to the participants, Catherine? If we
send out? Oh, sure.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yes, we will share these slides to the participants so that, yes, it'll make a lot more sense, I think. What time are we at here? I think we can take a couple more questions. Here's a question from Susan. What were the sources of the information librarians provided? Did they use any subscription databases or all open access?
We heard EBSCO quite a lot. We heard Consumer Health Complete quite a lot. We heard library databases much more often. Like people just don't get so specific, but yes, there is a strong sense that they are using library databases when they have them. But I had several respondents talk about going to free web sources right away because of the terminology problem. That the librarians themselves don't seem always to feel comfortable searching the library databases, which is rather ironic. And so, and I don't know how people feel about Consumer Health Complete, but I actually teach a course in digital health which Sam was a graduate of. And I have my students walk through the different library databases that purport to offer consumer health stuff. And what is kind of ironic is that the products out there, I feel, have a very advanced level of terminology a lot of the time. And I heard this in my focus groups that some of these librarians have started to go straight to free web stuff because they know their patron will understand it. So it's definitely a conscious choice to turn away from databases sometimes, which I think is way better than an unconscious choice.
Right. Okay, just in the essence of time, I think I'm going to have this last question here, and we can move on to the next study. And if we have time, I can pull back to some of these older questions if we have some more time at the end. So this last one here, I have. What kinds of training for other staff in the library would be helpful to address or improve on these 5 key topics? Any ideas? Yeah,
so and we can talk about that at the end of the presentation too, because that is definitely, as you might imagine, what NNLM is really interested in. And we did ask an explicit training question. We asked for their preferences in training as well as content of training. And what we heard the most, and I always hear this whenever I ask, is webinars. Everybody wants webinars all the time. So the challenge, I think, is some of this stuff is going to be difficult to put in a webinar because it's so interpersonal. And so it's not quite as easy as just throwing up a list in PowerPoint, sort of like I'm doing right now. But I would think that several folks said they really liked in person. And I think what I'd love to think about is how to make these interpersonal situations easier for library workers through a webinar, because that's what they want.
Okay. All right, we're getting a couple more questions in, but in the essence of keeping us under the hour, Catherine, I'm just going to have you go on to the next study, and then I'll see if I can pull on some of these at the end.
Okay. So study 2 was the National Web-Based Survey, and I offer this in part because I think some of these responses really relate to study 1, but also I think it's interesting to look at how these particular challenges, these big ideas I asked you to think about at the beginning, and the attitudes among public library workers towards these challenges really play out in the context of a specific health information need, i.e., enrollment in the Affordable Care Act health plans. So study 2 was a study of the effect of the ACA on public libraries. And I should note, in case anybody was at MLA Annual 2017, I actually was recovering from surprise surgery during MLA Annual 2017. So my co-researcher, Alla Kesselman, and her colleagues who were at the Specialized Information Services Unit within NLM, they presented results of this study. I'm not going to completely repeat myself, but if anybody would like a copy of the MLA presentation, just send me a note and I'll be happy to send that to you. I do need to tell you a bit about the methods and the content of the survey for you to understand the findings, but I'm not going to repeat what was presented in 2017. This was a web-based anonymous survey that was funded by NLM SIS, and the survey was designed with a lot of consultation from the UW-Madison Survey Center. It was me and Alla Kesselman, Janice Kelly, and Colette Hochstein at NLM SIS who came up with the questions. Then the Survey Center actually deployed the web-based survey and handled data collection responses to the survey. And respondents were incentivized with an iPad for the library, not for them personally. So the population we targeted was staff at central libraries located in 20 US states, and the 20 were the 10 with federal health exchanges and 10 with state exchanges under the ACA. And we picked the 10 on each side for having a low ratio of central libraries per capita, which was my crude way at getting around the fact that because, of course, public libraries are so community driven, they are so subject to local control, that it's difficult to come up with a stratified sample except by things like community size, as I already discussed. And the problem is that I've never felt that really gets at some of the things that are really important to public librarians. And so we use the impact, high impact measure. Basically means states like the District of Columbia and Hawaii have one central library for the whole state. So by picking libraries in which there was a very low ratio of central libraries per capita, we were trying to establish that the library really mattered. So we took the 10 federal, 10 state health exchange libraries, and every single central library in those states got a print letter pointing them at a web-based survey. So the initial invitations went to library directors and heads of reference in public services. The survey respondents who consented got 22 questions, and a number of these questions had free text response options, which were very, very rich. The people who completed the survey could enter a raffle to win that iPad. So the questions really fell into two principal categories. The first was consumer health information resources, specific, what do you use to answer these questions? Because of course, that's what NLM really wanted to know. Then the second set of questions were around the ACA specifically and library activities. So of course, there will end up being overlap between some things. And the survey ran from September to November 2016, held up by a lot of bureaucratic, I'll just say barbed wire. So this was later than we wanted to run it, but what was odd was that with the pending presidential election, it turned out to generate much more response than we had actually expected, which was a good thing. So the results were this: we had 487 responses, of which 277 were complete. That is, they filled in every single option. Almost all the rest were nearly complete. So the Survey Center tells me I can say the response rate was 32%, which is actually pretty good for social sciences, believe it or not. The breakdown of response by community size, here I use the larger bins from IMLS, rural 57%, suburban 25%, and urban 18%. The next slide will show you from whence in the country our responses came. The numbers tell you the count of respondents from that particular place. If there's no number, that means there was just one response. So remember, unlike study number 1, we were only surveying people from 20 states, but you still get this big Eastern Seaboard concentration, but way more in the West. So I will focus here on responses to just one of the 22 questions we asked, given the audience for this webinar. This was not presented at MLA 2017. It's completely new data on this question. This question was, how can NLM help the library handle activities related to health information and the Affordable Care Act? So 51 respondents actually had trouble with the question. 2 of them felt no improvements were needed at all. Everything is just fine, thanks. And 2 said, I don't know what NLM is. NLM should provide, said the other people, these things. Training. Biggest response, training. Librarians need to know exactly what is available, said a rural library worker from South Carolina. Webinars. We want free online webinars that are archived. Staff can only take training in 1-hour increments at odd times, an urban librarian from Louisiana reported. So archived webinars, this person said, are an important resource. Webinars on basic medical terminology, health information resources, and collection development guides are always useful, said an urban librarian in Ohio. So specific to the Affordable Care Act, these particular comments. That libraries were listed as resource centers for the public. However, no training was provided, which made it almost impossible to do anything meaningful for the public. And this says no state provided because approximately a quarter of the responses, even though, remember, they could get an iPad if they said where they were, because otherwise we couldn't send an iPad to their library. Even with that incentive, a good 25% of respondents did not provide information on where they were from beyond a very, very general community answer, which is why I can say it was rural, but I can't say where it was from. So that's interesting to me. The main barrier, said a rural librarian in Minnesota, to helping librarians patrons with ACA is that we in small rural public libraries are so short-staffed that we don't have time to go to trainings that are hours away. So this is another vote for webinar. Webinar, please. It doesn't help the time problem, but it does help the distance problem. And a rural librarian in Colorado said that training staff to know how to help and how to protect ourselves sick, by not giving misguided advice. So there's advice raising its head again and saying, hello, this is something that people are concerned about. And I actually heard from 4% of the sample, 4% of the respondents, that they did not give out medical information and would not answer medical questions because of the advice problem. And so this seems to have been an issue for ACA questions as well. The next largest category was actually what several people asked about in this webinar, which is what are people using? What information resources could NLM help provide? So I really like some of these. First, Idiot's Guide to the ACA or ACA for Dummies. But this librarian said why. It's hard to understand for the untrained person. I would completely agree. Explaining it in simple terms would be great. So I think this is interesting, not just for the ACA specifically, but for any initiative that is given to us from above in our org charts, such as the White House. This is something I heard a lot, is that will mean that it is hard to understand for the untrained person. And so the library workers become, of course, the bridge to this important information. Then there's this one, I like this one, from an urban librarian in California. Make full text of articles and reports available online. And finally, I love this one. This could be a bumper sticker. Make use of Medline Plus, as well known as calling 911, Smokey the Bear, voting. Just love it. And it's from a rural librarian in Maryland. Then there are a few comments I want to highlight for you, both positive and negative, as to the relationship of the library to programs like the Affordable Care Act. And I want to underline again that this happens to be about the ACA, but I actually think it could be true for any federally stimulated health-related thing that public libraries are going to be asked to do. So positives, I heard this quite a lot, frankly, in both studies. In the ACA study, I heard community expectations mean that we make one of the best program partners for presenting information on government programs. They trust you more than they trust us, from a suburban librarian in California. I heard that quite a lot. I heard rural library workers in study number 1 who would tell me stories about patrons who are coming to them with lots of health questions, like individual people who clearly have health needs, and it's the trust factor that makes them do this. And that is why libraries struggle sometimes, because they recognize that they are the trusted source. Then an urban librarian in Georgia reported that staff loves to help patrons find what they need, but it worries libraries because it is such a critical and sensitive area. People's lives depend on giving the correct answer. Now that is something I would expect to hear from a medical librarian. It is wonderful and a bit scary to hear it from a public librarian, because it's true. Having brochures with clear, concise information is badly needed. So this library worker would like NLM to do more brochures. Here's negatives. Just to illustrate why this is a challenge. We mostly distribute information in the form of flyers pertaining to the Affordable Care Act. We do not answer medical related questions. We refer them to medical professionals since we are a public library, and that's an urban library in California. And then a rural library in North Carolina, respondent reported, we don't do that. It is not the responsibility of a library and its employees to help people sign up for the Affordable Care Act. Our state librarian has supported our libraries on this and has told us not to do so. I find that fascinating because, in fact, in Georgia, this is what happened. The state librarian did say, don't do it. In North Carolina, it was not quite the same directive, and I did hear from a number of North Carolina libraries that either didn't get the memo or disagreed with the state librarian. With this particular respondent, this was their justification. There is too much personal information required. It is not the responsibility of public librarians to help people to apply private and personal information that is none of a librarian's business to know. So I think, again, in the wake of other federal initiatives, you have to acknowledge that librarians like this are out there. And that's a quote from that particular one in North Carolina. So just to throw out some ideas here about the difference between advice and information. What is the difference? It's a hard one. And what are the implications for training public librarians in the health information space, whether it's post-MLS training, paraprofessional training on the job, or pre-MLS training, which is the kind I have to worry about as an educator. Very few incoming students to the MLS program in which I teach, which has been around for over 100 years, but I'm their first full-time medical person. Very few students have any idea when they come in that there is such a thing as a medical librarian. If they had paraprofessional experience in public libraries, 9 out of 10 of them have learned on the job that public librarians don't answer medical questions. So these are student preconceptions that are hard for students to get over initially. There are also some pedagogical hurdles that my colleagues and my directors and deans have to jump over. When Catherine Dames wrote that piece about unanswerable questions in 1931, her words were resonating in general reference texts for decades and decades that lived on. But in 2018, I think it's really important to understand that consumer health information isn't just a reference thing. So we see, and there's been research on this, wellness topics are popular in public library programs. What I find fascinating is I heard in my focus group study number 1, I heard a lot about programming, very interesting stuff on programming, even in the same libraries where the same respondent distances herself from answering medical questions. says, I walk away once the patron is sitting at the terminal because I don't think it's my business to help them evaluate information. In that same library, I'm hearing they do programs on wellness and alternative medicine. So health information is clearly all over the library in its programs, its collections, both print and digital. For the baby book readers through the senior citizens, it's not just a reference thing. But one thing I heard over and over again from my focus group participants was that their general reference class was the only place they might ever have heard about medical questions. And when they did, it was usually in an information ethics context, or as an example of difficult questions that might be against library policy to answer. That's when they heard about them. So finally, despite all the requests from participants in both Study 1 and Study 2 for lists of resources, good resources, curated resources, high quality resources, just resources, consumer health information provision, we all know, is not a problem that is solvable just by a list of resources, because it's fundamentally a transaction between human beings that have been trained to be sensitive to what they know, what they don't, what they can answer and what they can't, and when and where they should refer outside the library. That is not something you can do a bullet list and throw it up on your website and hope that it's done, right? So for next steps in research, I'm interested in evaluating the entire library as an institution in the context of its community to really understand that free flow of health information in, within, and out of the institution, because it's really clear from my 2 recent studies that public libraries do have an important role to play in health information provision to the public. There are library workers doing amazing things out there, which I will be writing up. There are also library workers who would like to be doing amazing things, but they are scared. And I think those are the folks that really need the training. So with that, let's do more questions. And here's my email address. So if there's something you want to talk about with me, feel free to write. Or if we don't get time to address your question, feel free to write.
Okay, sorry, I had to unmute myself. I guess pulling in from some of the questions that have been coming from the second study, I know you're talking about interactions being more transactional than just a list of resources, but we have a question about, do you know of any training or resources available that address this health information versus medical advice issue?
There is some good stuff out there, and it's mostly in the information ethics category. So, you know, and I have a colleague who's a lawyer who teaches information ethics in my school, and this is something that he and I have talked about quite a lot. The whole question of where is the line that you draw. So I actually, if that person wants to, that questioner wants to send me an email, I can point them at a text that I use when I teach my digital health class. But I think the difficulty is it doesn't tend to work its way into the required reference-like courses. It's sort of, you have to take an elective that sort of presumes you know you might be interested in health information to get the really good stuff. That's always been a challenge in our field, I think.
All right. Okay, another question we have from Noah. In the discussions of health programs, did you notice any trends in terms of what types of programs were offered? And assess them in any ways?
So that must be, I bet it's Noah Lenstra. Is that Noah Lenstra? I bet it is. Yeah, so yeah, we had a specific, what kinds of programming are you doing? And it was funny, the answers were either no, we're not doing any. And then we would ask, like, why do you think that is? And it tends to be because the people that said no, they would say, well, now that we're talking about it, would probably be a good idea, but we're very patron driven. So if the patrons come to us and say, we want a program on, you know, how to recover from bankruptcy, we'll do one. And so you have a sort of weird situation where a lot of patrons don't realize the public library is a health information place. And so they don't ask for health programs. The other kinds of responses we got were, oh yeah, we're doing lots of programs. I would say that 90% of them are in what I would personally call wellness. Yoga, lots and lots of yoga, way more Tai Chi than I thought there was in the world. Things that get people moving, things that get teens and children off their computer screens. Heard a lot of that. I did not hear a word about evaluation of these, except for the usual, the gate count, because libraries have to report those. And so people were very aware of what their biggest programs were, because size is something, of course, they're thinking about. But in terms of evaluation, that's an open research question.
Okay. I have another question here from Michael. He says, many state library administrative agencies have established relationships with public libraries and are prepared to deliver CE to the public libraries. Have you considered working with chief officers of state library agencies to help provide some quote unquote canned CE medical info presentations?
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic idea. I, as a full-time professor and a research one, don't get to do things like actually deliver services, but this is something that I want to talk to my public library student graduates about, is, how best to get this information. Here in Wisconsin, we do not have a state library. We have a state library-like thing, which is an entity within the Department of Public Instruction. So I have wondered about talking to folks about how best to do this. You're right, it's a very good idea. I have a full-time job doing something else, so it wouldn't be me, but I think it's a great idea. And I did actually hear from the focus groups many, many comments about their state libraries and what they do. So that's a great way to go.
Great. Let's see, I'm seeing some, Ann Glusker in the chat box is also providing a lot of ALA resources. So if you're interested in seeing some of the things that she's recommending, there are links provided there. It looks like Eleanor asked a question. You were talking about the programming that is provided at some public libraries. She asked, does wellness equal preventative med? Or are there more lifestyle, or are these more lifestyle info classes?
That's a great question. I would say they are more lifestyle, but I heard my respondents would say things like, I believe personally that this is preventive medicine. And they would say stress reduction. We do things that have been proven to reduce stress. So I think the motive is definitely preventive. It is not clear to me from what my respondents say that makes it into the programming. It's almost like they think that's the pitch, is to imply that it's for stress reduction. How much of an evidence base is talked about is really hard to tell.
Right. I guess pulling back from the end of your first study, there was some kind of back and forth questioning on turning away from known resources being a scary thought to some of the participants here. And like there were questions about what about ensuring it's evidence-based, or
Sorry, can you clarify ensuring what is evidence-based? I'm not sure what is the scary thought here.
it was, sorry, let me pull back up here. So talking about the free stuff on the web and just ensuring, I guess, gauging accuracy, helping patients.
Yeah, and we actually had a question about how do you personally, assess what you find. And yes, the turning away anecdote really, it's not an anecdote, she told us that's what she was doing. I have heard that before in other interview studies, and it basically, it is happening for a good intention, but I agree, it is frightening. Basically, people who express this are saying, I don't think it's my business to tell my patron what they should believe online. And so they're stopping because they consider that advice. And so how that particular library worker reconciles that with putting on a program on a wellness topic, I don't quite understand, because it seems to me that putting on the program is also a kind of advice if you're going to go that far. But there seems to be much more acceptance of community partners coming in and doing programs, and people who are practitioners in the community, like chiropractors or massage therapists. There seems to be this idea that that isn't the library. All the library is doing is hosting that, just like they host somebody who gives financial advice or talks about, makeup or something. And so librarians seem to feel much more comfortable because it's not them doing it.
Right.
It's the people they invite in.
I could see that. Okay, as we are winding down here, are there any, maybe a final question from anyone? If not, I will thank you, Catherine, for speaking to us today, and thank everyone who participated for watching. And
Oh, thanks very much, folks. And thanks for listening. And like I said before, just shoot me a note if there's more you want to talk about. This is my favorite subject.
Sure. I'm going to take back control here with my slides. Go to, and sorry. If you are interested in the, oh goodness, the references here for what Catherine was discovering, I'm just going to leave this up for a minute so that it's caught on the video. I'll also provide, if you're interested in the MLA credits, I'll provide a link in the chat to everyone here. I'm also including a link to those references if you would like those. And I will also send these out in the email with the slides, since I know we had some technical difficulties at the beginning. So the second link here for the survey will get you the MLA credit. If you don't want the credit, we would still ask that you would take the survey so that we can see how we're doing here with these presentations and we can make improvements and implement changes. Again, I will thank everyone for participating, and I will just stick around for a moment or two.
This video was produced by the National Network of Libraries of Medicine. Select the circular channel icon to subscribe to our channel. Select a video thumbnail to watch another video from the channel.